Here is an ad that's put out by Organize for Justice. I mean, remember now, we have two things that have been going on. One, Kamala Harris was sent to Arizona and to West Virginia to give interviews locally, which is going to make everybody in those states who watch the news going to see that.
But an aggressive approach by the Biden camp, and
to
that's
basically strengthen the spine, as it were, or the resolve, or however you want to define this, of the possible Democratic defectors. Here's Color of Change going after some of those Republicans to make it clear where the parties are on this. And the other thing, it's not just that the media has learned here. The Trump era ripped the very thin veneer off of the Republican deficit hawkery. The idea that we could overspend to overcorrect a financial crisis. Nobody can actually articulate that anymore with a straight face, unless they are literally just, completely shameless in parroting a partisan line. I mean, nobody can say this with a straight face anymore. And that is helping the Democrats. Here is that ad.
After all we've been through, the majority of Americans are united in support of a COVID relief bill that delivers aid to those struggling in this pandemic. But corporate-backed politicians like Susan Collins, Mitt Romney, and Joe Manchin are pushing President Biden to weaken his relief bill. What do these so-called moderates have in common? 3 millionaires who think hardworking Americans don't need major support during these difficult times. Tell President Biden, don't give in. Fight for a bill that delivers real relief for working families.
This is also different from the Obama administration. The idea that we are 2 weeks into this administration and we're already seeing outside expenditure groups pressure Biden and go after wayward Democrats. I mean, just having and I think the White House gets it. I mean, that's watching Kamala Harris being deployed there makes a real difference. Now, here is West Virginia Governor Jim Justice, and hard to know whether this wasn't a function of Kamala Harris coming into his backyard and also making it clear we need to go big. But here's Jim Justice, and this is going to help when it comes to Joe Manchin as well.
Economic relief is critical for Americans right now. It's critical to your folks in West Virginia. You've been clear about your desire to support President Biden, to work across the aisle. When it comes to this COVID relief bill, I wonder what is more important to the people of West Virginia and to you. That Biden's $1.9 trillion bill passes, even if it's without Republican support and through reconciliation, which would mean bigger checks to your folks in need, or that it's a bipartisan agreement, even if it's less money?
Well, first and foremost, I wish we'd all come together, and that's just not blowing smoke. I mean, that's just because I don't do that. But the other flip side of it is this, Poppy, we've got a lot of people in West Virginia that are still struggling with paying their power bill because they got laid off because this pandemic just swept their job away from them.
Right, so which one is it?
And I mean, at the end of the day, really and truly, Poppy, what we need to do is we need to understand that trying to be, per se, fiscally responsible at this point in time with what we've got going on in this country, if we actually throw away some money right now, so what? We have really got to move and get people taken care of and get people back on balance.
Hell yeah.
And I want to work with the Biden administration just like I worked with the Trump administration, and I want us to move forward.
That's really significant to hear from a Republican like yourself in a state where your Democratic Senator, Joe Manchin, thinks these payments are not targeted enough. Have you talked to him about it?
Well, I have not talked directly to Joe about that and everything. I don't really know exactly what the thinking could possibly be there. I mean, we got people that are really hurting. I mean, that's just all there is to it. And on top of that, here's a perfect example, Poppy. My executive assistant came in the other day and said, not far from my home, there was an elderly man that froze to death in his house and everything. Probably couldn't afford to pay the power bill. There's so many different things where people are really, really hurting. Okay. And today, we've got to move. We can't hold back. We've got to move.
what was amazing was Poppy Harlow's, is that her last name?
Yes.
Look on her face when he said, I don't care about if we waste a little bit of money, we need to go big. And she just realized like that, that is incredibly compelling. I mean, that should be, in every ad. That is what's going to drive this process forward. Now, with that said, there's some difficulty here that is not just a function of will. There are multiple ways to address this. But one of the problems with reconciliation is a law that was passed in 2010. Part is the sequestration. And frankly, this is what people, when people criticize the Obama administration, it is over their turn to austerity in 2010. It was their fear and their indulging of the Republican lie of deficit hawkery. And we still have people like Nancy Pelosi, who is a big acolyte of Pete Peterson, who was the former Nixon Commerce Secretary, who spent billions, was a billionaire who spent hundreds of millions of dollars in creating a Pete Peterson Foundation that essentially promoted austerity politics. And so this isn't just a Republican conservative theme. There are Democrats who have embraced this, and certainly a lot of those financial types in the Obama administration, they embraced this austerity. And it was a huge mistake. It was a mistake both at a policy level. We had such an anemic and slow recovery, and on a political level, which is why by the time Obama left office, we had lost 1,000 seats across the country to Republicans, and including the House and the Senate. And so the administration seems to have learned, to a certain extent, the Democrats, more broadly speaking, Chuck Schumer echoed this yesterday, seems to have learned this lesson. He specifically said, we're not going to make the mistake we made in 2009. Now, one of the problems you have is like, okay, how do you do this with a filibuster in place in the Senate? We know that Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema have at this point said they won't vote to get rid of the filibuster. Remains to be seen if there is any other mechanisms that can go forward. We will see if that happens. But the reconciliation process requires essentially no addition to the deficit over a 10-year horizon. Now, what does that mean in practice? We just had a bill that cut $2 trillion worth of taxes about 3 years ago, passed by the Republicans through reconciliation. That bill would have automatically cut Medicare because of this 2010 law to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. It would have also cut other domestic spending programs, billions of dollars. However, to avoid that, Democrats joined Republicans in voting and passing the 60 vote threshold to provide a waiver. Now, there's some question as to whether conservatives and Republicans in this era would do that in this instance. Highly unlikely. So the question becomes, how do you get around that? There's a bunch of different ways that people are suggesting as to how you do this.
And can I add, Sam, there is political value in making Republicans own the fact that they might be trying to cut Medicare, cut Medicaid, cut Social Security, which, you know, they've gotten very close in the past, but often the political blowback and fears that they haven't fully touched that hot stove yet.
That's right. And Social Security is statutorily protected. That would not be subject to cuts, but just Medicare.
Yeah.
So this is a 2010 law. It is known as PAYGO. This is a law, not the rule that was in the House that was suspended for the sake of COVID. These automatic cuts can only be, at this point, avoided with 60 Senate votes. However, like I say, Republicans could join Democrats and vote for a waiver. Unlikely. Congress could declare the relief bill an emergency measure, which would exempt it from pay-go. But to do that, you need 60 votes. So that's unlikely to happen. Lawmakers could use future reconciliation bills to offset and balance that out and restore Medicare cuts. However, there's a lot of things that the Biden administration wants to do with the future reconciliation bills. They only get 3 bites at this apple. We'll talk about that. That's also one of the reasons why you're not seeing the rollback of taxes right now, because this is all about trying to get these bills to be net neutral. And so you could roll back some of those Trump tax cuts and do that now. However, then you lose that cachet of money. It's almost like a salary cap, if you will,
I will. Yes.
In basketball. I knew you would. And they want to reserve that money for when they do big infrastructure spending, because they feel that politically speaking, they have more latitude with COVID relief because it has a sense of urgency and it is at least has a feeling of being much less discretionary. You could also shove the restoration of this Medicare funds into some other must-pass bill over the course of the year, like the continuing resolution. Otherwise, you get a government shutdown, and that's where you start to hold Republicans accountable.
And you can kick that further down the road towards the midterms, when that kind of discussion becomes a lot more relevant and a little bit further removed from COVID, when, a second chance to hold Republicans accountable.
Without a doubt, Medicare is an incredibly popular program, and them voting, if you phrase it in the if you can control the media narrative and make this not about adding to Medicare, but rather preventing cuts from Medicare, that could work. David Dayen on Twitter suggests if you do the checks and the shots, in other words, if you get a smaller bill with 60 votes with these Republicans now, that gets you checks to people and shots to people. And let's say you take $800 billion off the table, $700 billion, right? The Republicans are coming in at $618 billion. They're cutting extended unemployment benefits. They're cutting direct payments. They're cutting child tax credits. They're cutting child care. The only thing that they're maintaining is small business funding for $50 billion. But if you can get, this is one theory, you get the Republicans to sign off on, let's say, $900 billion. When you go into reconciliation, this becomes the value of the $15 minimum wage. Because there are multiple studies out there that show adding, increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour will add $65 billion a year in payroll and income taxes.
And you can use the Republicans' argument against them, which the whole push behind the Trump tax cuts was that it was going to create so much revenue that they would pay for themselves. Obviously, that was a lie that completely discounted the findings of the bipartisan CBO report, but you can still use that argument rhetorically against them when it comes to the minimum wage, which I guess it's dubious if it would be able to be used in budget reconciliation, but you're saying you're a little more confident than I was when I floated it out there like a few weeks ago, I guess.
The idea that it would add this amount of money to the operating budget is a good argument that it could be in reconciliation. But even more important, $65 billion a year over 10 years is $650 billion. Plus, it will also have another effect of diminishing the number of Americans who might need things like food assistance, because it's raising a lot of people out of poverty. And in that case, you have now got room in your salary cap of at least $650 billion to offset any spending you do. Now, there's danger here, because if you do checks and shots in the first round, you might weaken the response of folks like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema. They might be less interested in passing something in reconciliation. So there's but that also depends on how the CBO scores. There are studies out there, we can't tell if the CBO will score the minimum wage in that way as well. And then the other way of doing this is just get rid of the 60 vote threshold and get rid of the filibuster. So there's a lot of different ways around this, but it is complicated. And at this point,